Welcome to Resiliency Redefined. I'm your host, Robyne, and I am thrilled to share with you information about resiliency, well-being, performance, education, business, parenting, and everything in between. I'm committed to joining you each week to talk about these big ideas and bring them into action, habits, tools, strategies, tactics that allow us to finally uncover what it takes to truly be well. And I'm just so excited that you're here. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Resiliency Redefined. I'm thrilled to be joining you today to answer some questions that have come in. And the one that I thought we could kick it off with is from centerpiece_Jim. And this came in through Instagram. How do you not pay attention to the noise while you're trying to find success? I love this question on so many different fronts. So today I thought we can take a deep dive into some of the habits of minds and practices that allow us to stay focused on our goals or on making what matters most matter most, as I like to say. So first and foremost, thank you to centerpiece_Jim for reaching out on Instagram to ask the big question. I'm excited to spend time with each and every one of you taking that dive to see what we can do to, again, create these habits of mind that are going to set us up for success. And I'm very glad you're here to have this conversation today. So when we think about those habits of mind, what I find useful is to take a wee bit back, step back to think about some of these habits of mind or these practices or even these tendencies with our thinking. So our thinking, it's actually pretty amazing, the human condition and how it can generate ideas, how we can think about different things in the past and the future. And, there's even lots of research that talks about so often that, the person who's trapped in the future often will feel anxiety, and the person who is trapped in the past will also tend to feel a sense of depression or depletion. So it's just amazing all the different places and spaces our minds can go, especially thinking back to our toddlerhood or our childhood when we think about just this vast open idea that were available to us, the imagination, the creativity, just the limitlessness to our thinking. I remember so many years ago, we were watching television and there was a commercial on. I think it might have been Toyota, but I can't quite remember. But they were actually showing images of like real places in Ontario. And I remember there's this one particular image, and it was, I believe it was the Burlington Skyway. And, you see this like CRV or HRV, I don't even, whatever the Toyota, that was a Honda, my bad. That's okay. Reframe. What you need to know about this example was that there was this small SUV that was getting out of danger, and it was actually crossing the Burlington Sky Bridge. And one of the danger things was literally this like monster that came out of the water. And I remember watching this commercial, not really paying much attention to it, giving it much mind. And Jackson turned to me and he's like, "Is that real? Like, is that in like Ontario?" And I paused and I was looking at him. I'm like, "No, dude, that's like, it's all graphic. Like, there's no massive monsters in Lake Ontario." And he's like, "Good." I think I would have been a wee bit nervous, like driving over that next time we go to Niagara Falls if there was. And I remember just having this pause, and I remember looking at him. And again, he was pretty little, but just this notion that our thinking and our mind, until we put some guardrails or parameters around what is real and what's not real, like we might think that there are massive monsters in Lake Ontario over the Burlington Skyway Bridge. Now, why I share that with you is that when we are little, our mind essentially is like the Wild West. Ideas pop in, things happen, and that's because our minds are having this massive learning explosion. We're getting all these new connections, all these new synapses are joining together, and oh my goodness, it is just limitless. Things that we can think out, we can imagine about, and just what's possible. And as we grow and learn and put some guardrails or parameters around our thinking, we're going to start to notice that we kind of dial it back. But what also happens is we become a wee bit rigid about things that we will now call beliefs. So follow me with this one if you can, if you want to. So we have an idea that pops into our mind. Now, remember, we are the thinker, we are not the thought. We have very little control of what pops into our minds. Now, there are some places where we do have control. So, for example, if you just watched a super scary movie and then you try to go to sleep, you might be more likely to have intrusive dreams about something that was scary because you just had stimuli before you went to sleep about something that was super scary. So we have a wee bit of influence on general bits and pieces of information that our thinking self will pick up. But ultimately, we are the thinker. We are not the thought. We don't get to control what pops into our mind. So when we think about this in terms of the noise and like the negativity, well, we are trying to focus on our goals. I find it really helpful to remember that this information is coming in and we sort information. And what happens is more that this information starts to come in and we start to have these thoughts. And then what happens is we start to have what we call thought practices. We start to maybe think it over and over again. And we think it over and over again. And remember, we talked before about how, like, essentially we start to create these like trenches in our brain matter. So it becomes more smooth for ideas to follow along that path. We can create these deep, deep trenches of thought. And eventually, those deep trenches of thought, repeated patterns, will become beliefs. So, any belief that we have is simply a thought that has been practiced, that has been repeated to get the grooves deeper. Now, it doesn't mean the belief is true or not true. It's not a moral issue. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is how we generate some of these thought practices. And the more we practice anything, it's going to become smoother. And that's going to become this trench, which eventually will become a belief. Now, if you're still with me on this example, the idea here is that we want to be mindful about what information that we keep on repeating or what we pay attention to, because our energy and our focus goes in the direction of what we are paying attention to. So if we are paying attention to a lot of those interrupts and a lot of those noises, or perhaps some of that negative thinking, what often happens is it becomes easier for our brain to recall information from those places because those pathways have become so smooth. So, that narrative, we want to make sure that we are ensuring, again, I just did a double piece there, sorry. We want to make sure that we are setting ourselves up so that repetition is happening in a positive way. So that way it's working us towards our goals, not working us away from our goals. Now, when it comes to that inner critic or that inner dialogue, you might have noticed it's not often very kind. It's often not even very useful. And sometimes it might not even be true. There's also some interesting research that talks about if we took a deep dive into that inner narrative, especially as it leans to the inner critic, you might notice it sounds like somebody who perhaps said some of that to you earlier on. So it might sound like a difficult sibling. It could sound like a difficult boss. It could sound like a tricky parent, maybe even just a friend. But what's interesting is we take in some of that information. And so the tone, the language that that negative critic or our inner critic tends to hold has usually been kind of planted in there one way or another through our lived experience. And then we essentially reinforce it. We keep it alive by revisiting it. So, what I think is really helpful when we are first just becoming aware of our thinking patterns is to open up this sense of curiosity. So, anytime we face a problem from that perspective of curiosity, it loosens its grip because we're not talking about it as right or wrong, or whether or not should it be there in the first place, or who planted it there, or who kind of installed that button. And I often make reference when we're talking about difficult conversations. The persons that usually can push our buttons the easiest are the ones who like actually installed them. They know what they're doing when they push your buttons. But the invitation is to meet with it in a curious way, because again, it loosens the grip, it loosens the power. Now, in speech, and I believe this was Socrates, we might want to I don't know, see Ryan Holiday can reference this for us. Pretty sure it was Socrates who talked about the three gateways of any communication. Okay, he said there were these three gateways, and the three questions that we ask for information to pass through our mouths to be able to share with others, number one, is it true? Is it kind? And is it useful? Okay, true, kind, or useful. And sometimes I've also heard useful be interchanged with necessary. So again, you can play with that in terms of whatever suits you best. But is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary or useful? So we use that as the kind of rule of thumb when we are sharing information with other people, when we're providing feedback, when we're, talking to the kids about what it is appropriate to say, what might not be appropriate to say. This idea, is it true? Is it kind? Is it useful / necessary? Well, my big invitation for you here to be able to start to just be aware of some of the noise. Maybe it is that inner dialogue, or maybe it is that critic, or whatever that might be, is to start using that practice of gateway with ourselves. So instead of, again, being critical at ourselves for, thinking all these negative things, or getting distracted by the noises, or being distracted by the negativity about maybe our past experiences, right? Especially assuming, I'm guessing here, if this question is coming in for the gym and, here we are trying to be successful, but this stuff gets in the way. We carry a lot of old narratives that often get in our own way. Usually the biggest villain in our stories is actually ourselves. Like, we are the persons that are standing in the way of our greatness. That's a whole other episode as to why. We can dive into poppy syndrome one day if you want to. If you actually want to hear about poppy syndrome and why we are our own worst enemies, please feel free to let me know and we can talk about that next episode, or another one if it's useful. But again, using gateway, I want you to ask yourself, and again, in a curious way, when a thought pops into your mind, especially when it's evaluating your own performance, behavior, your feelings, just asking yourself, is it true? Right? So if I'm like, oh my goodness, I always drop the ball, or I'm always running late. If that's a narrative that I say to myself, my goal is to try and catch myself saying it next time and simply say, is that true? Well, maybe quite often I'm running late, or quite often I'm behind, but it's definitely not always. And then the question about, like, is it kind? In a moment when I'm running late, reminding myself of all the other times I've ran late, is that actually kind to myself if I'm trying to just get to where I need to go? Probably not. Is it necessary or useful? Likely not. So again, it's not necessarily judging it per se, but what I encourage you to do with that gateway around questioning is just to slow down not long enough to notice, if we're not intentional, we can be saying a lot of really mean things to ourselves. And I think that becomes a lot of noise. And when those things don't get addressed, what happens is, because we say them so often, remember that then becomes a belief. I'm likely to pick up the belief and hone and reinforce and fine tune and even forge this belief that I'm someone who is always late. Well, you know what? There is some truth that sometimes I am running late, but often than not, if you think about some evidence, I actually can show up often on time, where I have to be, when I have to be there. So again, just kind of loosening that grip of some of these beliefs, I think, is a way to start navigating some of that noise, some of that, again, especially that noise that is derailing us. Another question that I like to think about here is, when I notice that, for example, we're like, trying to work towards our goal, is to ensure that we have clarity on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I know that seems quite straightforward, but the reality so often is these goals become massive. They become like almost like this drifting effect, where so much information or so many different pieces and parts gets wrapped into it. It's actually really hard to know if we are on track, or the alternate, or the other side of it is often what happens is it's like all or nothing. And if this thing is so massive, and again, this sprawling effect, a lot of times we might not even realize that, we're working towards getting the good thing done or achieving the goal. But because there's so many other pieces, like the noise in terms of lack of clarity, it can actually derail us a wee bit. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that's useful to answer your question. Another question that I got asked is, what happens if there, and again, this kind of riffed off the previous question, is if all we can have is like this spotlight on the negative, right? Now, worrying is a habit. Worrying is a habit. There's a wee bit of temperament involved, but more often than not, worrying is a habit, and a mind left unattended will kind of gravitate to some of these practices, again, that we have rehearsed mentally, which will create these difficult to kind of navigate trenches, which puts our thoughts in these patterns or these traps. So, again, when we think about that notion of, again, that tendency of worrying or how do you let things go, my gentle invitation, first and foremost, is just to slow down. Just pause and actually sit with the thought to see if you can essentially bring it full circle. Now, often when we worry, it's this idea that it's like just this perpetual noise in the background. The reference I gave you before is kind of like if you've ever like thrown like overalls or maybe like a zippy in the dryer, maybe even a running shoe or a sneaker, and it's in the dryer and it's like thump thump or ding ding. It's this repetitive noise. Worry is kind of like that. It's like we don't give it enough attention to actually address it, but it's sucking out some of our energy and our cognitive resources by not addressing it. So it becomes just kind of like this, again, background noise that is actually depleting us. And when we are depleted in any form of depletion, we are not our kindest self. We're definitely not our wisest self. So, again, when we think about this idea of the worry, what if we actually just paused and just sat with it? We actually just sat with it for a minute and not try to ignore and override, but ask the worry, again, coming back to curiosity, what are you trying to have me pay attention to? Or what are we really talking about here? And as my dear friend Peter Katz says, get the answer, but then pause and see if there's an answer behind the answer. What are we really talking about here? So when we sit down with that recurring worry thought, my invitation to kind of help, again, block out that noise instead of ignore and override, sit with it, pull up a chair beside it and say, what am I missing? What am I trying to get myself to pay attention to? Meet yourself in a curious place. And so often we'll just call it worry, perhaps, but there's other things that are at play that are trying and vying for our attention. So it allows us to have a wee bit of a conversation in a deeper, more meaningful way, moving towards resolution or reprieve, or perhaps just recognizing this is something that I need to carry and something that I learned to work with. So it's either like the situation changes or I have to change to navigate it, whatever the course might be. Now, another question that came in that I think does tie all of this together was somebody asked me about, the let them theory is really popular right now by Mel Robbins. And gosh, she's got an extraordinary career doing great things. And it's always awesome to see somebody doing great work. And I appreciate for some people, the let them theory might be an oversimplification for some situations that we don't actually want to let them. Okay. So if you noticed, you're kind of struggling with kind of that notion of just let them do their thing, but it still hurts or it's still hard. I think it's important that we put some tender attention around that because I think that's what's going to be necessary for true healing, not just ignoring and override, but actually true healing. And I recall years ago talking to a therapist who made the comment that, it's like deeper when you are trying to get the attention of the person that has hurt you to try and convince them that like you're a good person or they shouldn't have mistreated you or there's still misapprehensions or misunderstandings about it. Like that's actually a sign of trauma that we're chasing them down to or wishing for their approval, even though we know that might be something that's not available to us. And I remembered it cued for me the old example. And again, I don't know if this is considered a proverb or a lesson, or again, it's just the story, this beautiful story that gets passed on around that notion of going after somebody who might have hurt us, wanting to fix it or wanting their approval or wanting it to be something different. And the story went along the idea that if you, for example, were walking and you got bit by, let's say, a snake, why would we chase the snake down to say, why did you bite me? Well, it's in their nature. And maybe it might not be in their nature per se in a human example, but the person that hurt you in that situation, they were unskilled or unwilling to do it in a different way. So instead of putting our energy chasing down the snake to say, why did you bite me? I'm a good person. Why would you do that to me? It's actually recognizing that more often than not, this isn't about just letting it go or let it happen. And that's where I believe the tension is, because we want to acknowledge the fact that it hurt, that we've been disappointed or we've been let down or things aren't how we wished them to be. And I don't think we can just let that go. I think we actually have to give that, again, as I said, some tender focus to make sure that we are okay. And what does it look like? And one of my favorite ways when I'm working with people one on one, and I've just started coaching again, which is okay, that's a whole other episode. It is amazing to be back in a role as a supporter and educator. But this idea of there's something very powerful when we can show up with those big feelings and recognize where we are today. We are a person who would have protected someone from that happening to them. Like you could have, so me at 46, when I look back on some of the hurts, I realize at 46, I am a woman now who would have protected 15-year-old Robyne, 7-year-old Robyne, 22-year-old Robyne, definitely 30-year-old Robyne. Like I am now somebody who would have protected that earlier version of myself in a different way. And I think once we start to process, once we start to build our perspective, some of this noise and some of this negativity, it won't grip us in the same way. Now, my friends, I'm super mindful of time, and I know there was a few other questions that came in, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to those ones today, but I will keep going. I will keep going because, again, I want to be useful. And my invitation and my wish to each and every one of you is that I hope there are better days ahead, brighter days ahead, lighter days ahead for people who feel like they're carrying a lot, because by the sounds of some of the questions, people are going through a lot. And I see you, I hear you, I read all of the questions and comments that are coming in. So thank you for sharing them. I hope there was something useful. So again, the little takeaway here is when we come to this noise, when we come to these distractions, especially when they're self-induced, to use the gateway practice. Is this true? Is it kind? And is it useful? In the meantime, take good care. Please keep asking me those questions. I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks for listening today. Bye for now. Thank you for spending time with this podcast episode today. I hope you found something helpful in Resiliency Redefined. Please feel free to share it with somebody who you might think could benefit. Maybe there was something useful, something in particular that you think you could pay forward. Also, if you have a moment, please feel free to rate and review this podcast wherever you like to listen to your podcast. It means the world to me. And again, thanks for your time. Thank you for your interest. Take good care, and I'll see you next time.